Thank you for that. I'm Sid. I work on the design system teams at GitHub, and I want to talk about some code crimes that I've recently committed for good component APIs. So, disclaimer, these opinions are my own and don't represent the views of my employer yet. I'm working on it. I'll get them one day. So just to get a vibe check of the room, how do you folks feel about hacks or like bad practices in your code base? Just a show of hands of people think, if you have hacks in your code base, straight to jail, code is for purists. Somehow this side of the room is, yeah, this side is just lying. Okay, so it's interesting because when we talk about user interface design in front end, we always talk about how we need to make things simpler for the users. It should be intuitive. It should not be confusing. Like, remove most of the complexity out of the interface. But somehow when we talk about like API design or code, we're all about purity and craft of code and all these, there's like a fat book that I had to read. And it's strange because at the end of the day, people who read your code or use your code are also users. They also are just trying to get their job done and go home. So it's a bit strange that we have double standards for this. But anywho, let's talk about some crimes now that we've established that. I basically established I'm justifying my crimes because user interface design. OK. So to set some context, here's a component. And it opens up, and it has like a oh, nice focus. OK. It has like a focus trap, and you can click escape, and it closes. It has some accessibility features. And the way this works is it's called anchored overlay because the overlay is anchored to something. And the way it works is you control its state, so you give it open. Oh, by the way, this whole thing is in React. Sorry. But the crimes hold up in other frameworks as well. So you're not missing much. So what it does is you give it open state. You have to manage it on open, on close. And then you have to give it a render anchor. And this is a render prop kind of function. It gives you anchor props, which you pass on to your, usually use a button, so you pass it on to that. And anchor props contain things like on-click, but also ARIA expanded, the focus trap settings. So all of the features for accessibility are kind of baked into this anchor props. And finally, you just put everything inside as children, which makes sense. So I like this component. I feel like it has very good building blocks behavior. You can build a lot of things with this. And the thing that I tried to build was, on GitHub, there's like a pull request page. You've probably seen this. You select labels, or you put in a signee. I want to build this anchored overlay. Like, this is an anchored overlay. But we're only going to focus on, like, not the contents, because they're not as interesting, but how the API looks. So to start, if I have to build it with anchored overlay, what I'd end up doing is I'd, of course, like track the open-close state. I have to set open, set close. This is not very smart. I'll just move on. And then render anchor, you pass a button. And our design system guidelines kind of say that if it's a dropdown, then you should hint that the button is going to, like, visual hints as well. So it's advisable that you use a trailing icon and put like a tiny triangle caret thing there. So far, so good. And then, of course, you can modify it. There's multiple variants. You can change the icon, et cetera. Everything that the button supports, this anchored overlay button would also end up supporting. For now, let's just talk about this default state. So I like this till now. I'm very afraid to pass this on to folks that build applications at GitHub, because there's a lot of things that you have to do yourself. Like, you have to track open state, which feels unnecessary. This render anchor, like render prop API with anchor props, and you have to pass it down, you don't know what's inside this, right? So if you end up adding like an on-click, you might override it, or you'll have to merge like on-click and then anchor props, on-click, and then and something. So it's very easy to break this, which makes for a very bad component API. So if I'm building a reusable component for this, this is not how I want it to behave. What I would like is none of this. So let's, oh wow, I screwed up. OK. It's called selection menu, because anchor menu, this is used for selection. So let's just call it selection menu. And then I don't want any of this. I'm going to get rid of this. So it should be smart enough to figure out that pass on the anchor props inside. And then finally, if for selection menu, if this is part of our design recommendation, then we should just do it for people. So you don't have to pass an icon. You use selection menu. You use the selection menu.button. And finally, for good touch, the selection menu.overlay so that you can pass more props to the overlay. Wow, spelling. So this is how it works. Now for the interesting part, like how does the code inside look like? So there's the selection menu, which is not very interesting. It's just, it doesn't really do anything if you see the previous slide. It doesn't really do much. It just passes the children on. And then you have the menu button, which again is just a button, but hard-coded with trailing icon. And then we passed on the props so that if you want to override the trailing icon, you can. And then finally, the interesting bit, which is the menu overlay, this has the open and set open state so that the component handles it. You don't have to handle it yourself. But then what do you do about render anchor? Like in the anchored overlay API, it expects a component here. But we don't really have a component because our component is like here. This is the anchor. It's a different React component. So we need a way to move this inside these question marks. And one way to do that could be like handle pull state up. So in the selection menu, I'm saying this is an anchor, this is set anchor. And then I create a context. Some of you can see where this is going. And then inside the context, I'm basically saying anchor, set anchor, all children have access to this. So that inside my menu button, I'm just going to say if there is no anchor, just set the anchor as this button. Kind of weird, but I think it works. And then you say return null, right? Because we don't want this to render anything. We just want to set the anchor and then pass it on to menu overlay. Seems OK? Seems something like you've seen. Probably not a big fan, but familiar? Yeah, OK. So this is a bug, which is on client side, it kind of works really nicely. It just opens. But if you have server-side rendering, then you see that it kind of doesn't appear on the first go and appears after a while. And that's because this set anchor that we're doing here doesn't actually get called on the server. I mean, it does get called, but it doesn't really do a re-render. Because anytime you're using use state on the server, it would just initialize the state once. If you keep changing the state on the server, it's not actually going to re-render anything. And that's why we see a lag, because the lag is actually when the JavaScript arrives. So I'm going to do server-side rendering and then pause the client-side hydration. So this is what you get on the server, nothing. And after the JavaScript bundle arrives, React has hydrated, then you actually get this, because that's when the re-render happens. And this is my favorite part. Like if you're on slow 3G, this is how it looks. So it's a while, right? Let me show you again. I think I just got slow. So that's a long time, and that kind of sucks. So this is not, the API is fine, but obviously not good. So how can we set this anchor on the server itself, even though like it's different components? And the answer is crimes. So how we're going to do that is I'm just initializing an anchor as null. And then React has this top-level API called react.children, which lets you map through all the children and then manipulate them if you want. So what I'm doing here is I'm just looping through all the children. And I'm doing like this is just a debug, like child.type. And this is interesting because inside all of this JSX, React compiles to react.createElement, and the type is the component name. And a component in React land is just a function. So I can actually do something like this, which is if child.type is the menu button component, and then just say anchor is child, right? Crimes. Is this child kidnapping? I guess. And if the child type is overlay, then clone that thing and pass it on as render anchor, right? So just to recap what we're doing here, we're looking at the children's structure before any of this has rendered, by the way. This is all like just comparing the structure. If it's a menu button, kidnap the child, pass it on to menu overlay. I think this is child trafficking. So, and of course, this is my favorite part, which is you don't want two buttons, so you have to do a render null on the first one. So when somebody actually writes selection menu dot button, they're rendering nothing. What they're doing is like they're hijacking a child, passing it on to menu overlay. And probably for good measure, we should add like a warning. If it's not menu button or menu overlay, then just have like a helpful dev warning, which is like selection menu does not identify whatever you gave. Please use one of these. Here are the docs. Here's a link with cat pictures. So nobody got the joke, sad. And then because I don't hate my teammates, I just add like a comment, like this is a hack for good API, dragons beware, etc. So I guess I'm saying crimes are okay if you get away with them, because in this case, the folks that are using the design system are going to use the selection menu.button and selection menu.overlay, and that's all that it works with. So if I was building Material UI or Chakra UI, like an open source library, I probably wouldn't get away with this because you can bring your own components. But in the context of like a design systems component library, which only works for one company, these assumptions are fine. So hacks that make the API easier to use so that developers can do a good job, go home early, as long as they work with reasonable assumptions within the constraints. And by constraints, I mean you can only use the design system components from the same system. And I've highlighted good job because I guess the thing here is like nobody cares about how the component works. People care about building their UI, finishing their job, and going home, or I guess in working remotely, go to the couch. So that's kind of the goal. If a component can give you that quickly, it's a good component for me. OK, more crimes. So there's this settings list, I guess. If you go to github.com/settings, it kind of looks like this. And it's called a nav list because navigation list. And the way it works is you pass it navlist.item, you give it something, it accepts href because it's an anchor tag and an icon which renders here. And then finally, this is the selected state. And the way we do selected state is if there is an ARIA current, which is like if you have a navigation, then the current anchor should have an ARIA current, the one selected. And in this case, the ARIA current is page, because these are all independent pages. But the way we expect a user to set that is look at the window or the location. And if the path name matches this href, that means this page is selected. Not perfect code, but this is just like something similar to this, I imagine, will happen. And then there's like a bunch of these, because bunch of settings. And of course, there's like so many more settings, because GitHub is a mess. And with all of these, you can imagine that you can't parse this. There are too many. So a tiny UI improvement might be that we start grouping them. So I've put the common ones or the popular ones up top. And then I have navlist.group. Right? So I just made up a new concept of groups. And I give it the title. I give it the icon. It kind of looks the same, but it has this toggle thing. And then I can nest navlist.items inside. So these are top level. These are nested. And it kind of works like this. Of course, there's a bunch of them. So we put all of this. The interesting thing here is if you go to one of these and reload the page, this one would show ARIA current, because that's what selected. So you have the selection state. But this group should be open by default, right? Because if something nested is selected, when the page loads, you want this to be visible. Because otherwise, if it looks like this, you don't really know where navigation is. So that's what we want to do. OK, implementation. So navlist is pretty boring. It's a nav, renders a list. So there's a nav and a UL. Boring next. There's nav item. Inside a UL, you have li. Inside the li, you have a link component because it handles icon and stuff. It's an A tag next. This is where the fun lies. So nav group should somehow know that one of its child has ARIA current, right? So that it can open up. So it's an li. This thing is a button, because you click it, it opens, should be a button. And then inside that, you have children. So children, just to remind you, was nav items. And it's wrapped in the UL because they're li elements. OK, so till here, it's fine. Kind of add some class name, because if it's open, then it should be open, otherwise closed. And now we have to fill this open. Like somehow we have to figure out when it's open. So interactions are easy, because if it's closed, you set not open. How do we set the default state? That's kind of the question. How does it know? Because again, nav group is here, nav item is here. How do children inform the parent that something should change? So this is what the structure looks like. We could ask the user that, please pass us default open so that we can open the list. But if you think about it, this is how ARIA current works, and you have all of these hrefs. This is kind of what you'd have to do, where you just put all the URLs and say, if it's any of them, then it should be default open. I guess it's fine, it kind of sucks. You probably wouldn't have just strings lying around. It would be in like a navigation object, but it's still pretty trash. You'll have to do like a find, map over them, parse it in a Boolean, because default open can only be true or false. It's fine, but again, like we want our APIs to be like user interfaces and those same values that if it's extra work or annoying work that we can do for the user, we probably should. So let's get rid of that, come back to our nav group. And my first instant is context, right? We set a context, we wrap it, put a thing in the child informs the parents, la la. Quickly going to do that, wrap the parent. Inside nav item, I'm going to import context. It has open set open. If nav list item has ARIA current and the parent is not open, then set it to open. Seems fair. Again, the same, we've seen this before. I don't know why I repeated this. Works on client side, but the moment you have server side rendering, you'll have the same thing. But by default, it would be closed, and then it would open because this code wouldn't cause a re-render on the server. It would only happen on the clients. You have to wait for the bundle to download, la la. This is what you get on the server. JavaScript arise, React hydrates, and then it opens up. Depending on the speed, kind of looks cool or looks terrible, right? By this time, you probably read the page, you're reading something else, and then something opens on the left. This is what they call jank. Maybe Lighthouse doesn't like it, I don't know. So how can we, whoa, what did I do? No, wrong, sorry. Okay. Sorry about that. Yes, finally. So that's a bad idea because this load time sucks. How can we set this value on the server? So maybe we just reuse the child kidnapping that we had, crimes. And because this ARIA current is always based, like this nav group and ARIA current would always be on the direct child. And it seems fair to make the assumption that navlist group can only have navlist item. Seems fair. So we do the same thing that we did earlier, loop through the children. If any of them have ARIA current, set default open is equal to true. And all of this code would run before the state is even set. So it would work. Think. Remember I said like hacks an API and la la la, good job? As long as there are reasonable assumptions within the constraints. The first thing that people did with this is, so GitHub Docs is built with Next.js. And in Next.js, you don't just use link, the anchor tag, you use next link and its own router. So what they did was they wrapped this router thing, and then they said navlist.item is actually wrapped inside of a next link. And then the way they figure out ARIA current is like ask the router or something. So you end up with like ARIA current is here, and this is the parent, and nav list.group has nav item with next link. And there is no ARIA current here, right? Because you need the router and you need to wrap it. So this kind of breaks our child stealing because the structure is no longer reliable. And I guess this is a very valid assumption that people would use multiple routers. And in the common component library, we would never be able to predict what routers exist or what are the APIs. So we can't do kidnapping. We need to come up with something else. So the thing that I came up with, which is, this I'm leaving up to you, like crimes or no crimes, depending on who you ask. What I do is I create an ID, which is, it's an isomorphic ID, so it's same across server and client. And then I have this code, where I say, instead of like the React way, imperatively look for the group element, this one, right? I'm not doing ref because ref requires the thing to be mounted, hydrated, la la la. I want this to run independent. So I'm just doing imperative and saying, screw React. I'm going to say document.getElement.id, query selector inside, because query selector can go nested deep. It doesn't really care about structure, and it's pretty fast. It's natively supported by the browser, and if all of this exists, set default open, all of it happens before use state. But of course, you can't do that on the server because there is no document on the server. So you wrap it in document undefined, and then it doesn't really solve the problem because you still have, like it works on the client. So if there was a way to run this on the server, actually I don't need the server, I need the document. So I'm realizing that the problem isn't really server, the problem is the hydration. Like I have this giant React bundle with React, React router, React DOM, style components, I don't know, framework motion, something. JavaScript, you know how that goes. So it's a big bundle, it takes a bit time. What I want to do is run this sooner. I don't really care if it runs on the server, I just want to run it before the user is able to perceive things. So, of course, crimes. The crime that I want to do is I want to put an inline script, right? So when this component renders, it also puts a script here. And this script would run as soon as the component has mount. Like if it's server rendered, it gets pushed down the wire, the browser reads it, it renders all of this. This is an inline blocking script, it runs the script. The JavaScript bundle hasn't even started downloading. And React kind of has a nice way of doing this where you can say dangerously set inner HTML. And I'm just going to literally copy paste this. But I can't do default open, of course. So I'm just going to add this class. And this class is the same class that React eventually adds. I see some very scared faces. So again, run it with paused hydration. So you see, it still opens up because this didn't come from the server. When you click it, but it happens before hydration. And when I hydrate, nothing really happens because it's already open. And have you seen that error when React complains that the client and the server output did not match? In this case, we don't even have that problem because we made sure the output matches. Like the same thing that happens in the component happens before the components. So when it hydrates, React just takes over and it sees that everything is already how it should be. So it just assumes it came from the server, even though it came from us on our dangerously set in HTML. Works in slow 3G as well, because again, this is there as soon as the page is here, and then the JavaScript is arriving. I have no idea when it arrived or when it hydrated, because this already works. So, wait, this is not the slide. So, I guess crimes are okay if you get away with them, right? Because the goal of an API is to help developers do a good job by abstracting annoying work away from them, especially work that is not core to their expertise. Like the accessibility work, the opening, the nav, all of this is like design decisions and accessibility baked in. If you're working on that settings page, your core experience or your core work right now is, I guess, to build those forms and save all of that data back to the servers. The UI part, the more it's already done for you, the better. I guess that's my talk. So.